of this process to support Sheena's and share my information that I can, and I hope everyone enjoys. So in case you didn't know, this is Understanding Postpartum and Eating Disorders, Ways to Support Ourselves and Others. So let's just dive right in. I apologize in advance because when I formatted the PowerPoint to a PDF, some of the words shifted just a little bit. So there's a couple things that are cut off, but I will speak to every slide. So hopefully that'll help kind of keep us all on track. So my name is Taylor Burciul. I am running this webinar based on some knowledge and experience, both personally and professionally, that I've gained throughout a handful of years. So I am a registered social worker who works in clinical roles in a couple different organizations, including Maternal Health Niagara, which works to support individuals along the journey of fertility, pregnancy loss, and parenthood across Ontario. We have a really wonderful team. I see Sarissa's here also joining us, who is part of our team also, so welcome. In addition to the maternal side in a clinical sort of mental health role, I also am a certified labor doula. So a lot of my work in the perinatal world has come from firsthand experience in the birth room, in the postpartum spaces with individuals. I also have some knowledge and background of information through working at a couple different agencies with eating disorders, including Sheena's Place, where I had the opportunity to complete my practicum during my master's. So I'm feeling very blessed to be welcomed back. It's going to be a good day, I think. So I'm looking forward to it. So a lot of what I'm sharing today is going to be in relation to the core pieces of mental health. And it will be a little bit less about specific diagnoses of eating disorders or specific diagnoses of the postpartum period and what that sort of looks like. So if there's any questions that are specific to disordered eating or specific to pregnancy, feel free to ask throughout, but I've tried to make it as integrated as possible. I will use language here and there that will swap between referring to you as if you were the individual experiencing this, and also using language that could be relevant to an individual who is helping support someone going through experiences similar to this. So just a point to keep in mind. So Caitlin, thank you so much for summing up some of this fun stuff. I threw a quick slide up for webinar guidelines there, but as discussed, video is optional and keeping yourself muted is a preference and preferred, so thank you very much. And if there is any questions, of course, Caitlin and I are here to help with that process. And as Caitlin said, this isn't a support group, so there is some potential triggers that could come. I will try my best when I'm starting on that slide to give a heads up, so if there is a space that is needed to step away or take a break. But I do apologize if I do miss along the way, because I get a little bit hyper and excited and jump right into the content sometimes. So yeah, see what we got. I would love to just start off by getting a feel for the space and sort of feeling out where everyone's at, what the goals are for being in this space if individuals are feeling safe enough to do so. Totally optional. Some of the perks of this online experience is that it can feel more safe, and if you choose not to engage or to engage, it can feel like a safer space to share. But I would love to know what's brought you into this e-space and if there's anything in particular that you're hoping to have discussed or addressed. So I'm just going to pause for a moment and allow people to flag themselves or shoot a message if anything comes up there.
I can share if no one is wanting to share.
Awesome.
I can't see myself. I'm trying to like I'm familiar with Zoom, but for some reason I hit something and I don't know if you can see me speaking.
I can, yeah.
But someone actually mentioned this workshop, and I got really excited because I'm 9 months pregnant and I'm in recovery for an eating disorder. And I just know that I'm going to learn some things today that I can pass on to my support team. My partner is very supportive, and my parents have been amazing, but sometimes they don't understand. Even being in 2 years of recovery, there's still things that I do that I don't even understand. So it will be really nice to learn and have that opportunity to kind of be with like-minded people, and just be able to take the opportunity to educate myself so I can educate my support team, because I'm really nervous. Like, I'm about to have a baby, and I don't know how I'm going to feel after. Like, I've been feeling pretty good during the pregnancy, but I've been having some days just, with my body changing throughout this pregnancy. I've had some great women who have, we've stayed in contact throughout the pregnancy, which is really refreshing. So that's why I'm here. I'm taking a little break from work to be able to participate in tonight's event. So thank you for putting this on.
Thank you so much for sharing so openly and honestly, and congratulations. I'm hopeful that you can find this this beneficial. And the nice thing about this too is having it recorded. It's something that you can share with loved ones and caregivers after the fact also. So the information can really be relayed in a wonderful way. I'm coming to enjoy the Zoom process, as stressful as it can feel sometimes. So thank you for sharing so much.
Thank you.
I'm just skimming through the chat a little bit. It looks like we've got a fair amount of individuals who are in the healthcare field, but also may have some personal experiences, which I think speaks to a lot of individuals who choose to come into this role, right? Everyone has a little bit of a personal experience and wants to be able to support themselves and others. So we've got Chanel, a naturopath, wonderful. Sarissa, who's on my team at Maternal Health Niagara. She just started, so I'm excited to share the space with her there. Jamie, also again, looks like in a healthcare role. Wendy, beautiful. A dietitian, awesome. Psychiatrist. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate just getting a better idea of where everyone's at. If everyone's okay with that, I'm going to move forward then. So just to kind of set a bit of an agenda today, although this webinar is called Understanding Postpartum and Eating Disorders, there are some points which are relevant both to pregnancy and the postpartum period. So I'm starting with a lot of information and facts on the prevalence and the common experiences that can come for those who are in the postpartum period, who may also be struggling with body image or with symptoms of eating disorders also. So for those living through this, this is not information I'm sharing in an attempt to cause distress or concern, but my hope is that with this information, you can use it to empower yourself, normalize, and educate yourself, so that way you can feel like you're in a better space and feeling a little bit more prepared also for the things that can come. So with that information, hopefully you'll be able to notice the symptoms and signs and be able to tackle them a little bit more easily also. After I get into some of the common experiences, challenges, and symptoms, I will dig into some of my favorite core strategies and interventions. So I tried to pick strategies that I think could support individuals on a wide range, because postpartum period and pregnancy can be very individualized and very wide range of struggle, and same with eating disorders. So I picked things that I thought were quite general that could then be in turn individualized based on your experience. So yeah. I'm gonna just dive right in then and start with describing the postpartum period, because I think this is something that is going to be helpful moving forward if we're all on the same page. And the postpartum period can be defined in a variety of different ways. And I wanted to share my general sort of definition based on a mental health perspective of things. So in the postpartum period, it begins after a child is born and ends when hormone levels in the uterus returns to its pre-pregnancy size. So typically this can be anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks, but I would argue the postpartum period can extend into over a year after a baby is born, especially on an emotional level. So during this time, of course, you're getting to know your baby while also physically healing and emotionally adjusting to your new reality. So it can be a very overwhelming experience, and overwhelming is a word that you will hear out of my mouth a lot tonight. So prep yourself for that, because it is overwhelming, and it's a transformation that individuals experience that comes with a lot of struggles, but also a lot of joy. So in relation to eating disorders and the postpartum period, research shows us that 1 out of every 21 women in North America will meet the diagnostic criteria for an eating disorder. So that is quite a large number. I think this is something that isn't discussed often enough, and this is a period of big physical changes, so it can be quite triggering. Perfectionism, loss of control, feelings of isolation, memories of childhood can bubble up to the surface. So these things can occur, and it can become a slippery slope to engage in eating disorder symptoms or to re-engage in eating disorder symptoms if you were in a period of recovery. There's a lot of feelings of uncertainty, vulnerability, fear. This is all really common, and shame can come with the process of having just like eating disorder symptoms also. But I think the key piece here is that most birth people will struggle in some capacity with the changes that happen with their body in particular. So I put a quote there that I snagged from Nita. I think it's wonderful and really sort of encapsulates the joys of pregnancy and the postpartum period. So the nonstop counting, comparing, measuring that happens during these 9 months and beyond can tap into some of the very vulnerabilities that are linked to an eating disorders and food and weight obsessions. And I'll discuss a little bit of this more throughout the process, but something to keep in mind moving forward is that it can be very triggering, and the healthcare world sometimes can neglect eating disorder symptoms or just acknowledging that certain things can be triggering. There is a lot of counting, there is a lot of weighing, there is a lot of monitoring, and that can be a scary place for individuals that are living through this. So I want to give a brief trigger warning. I wanted to share what is considered medically normal in terms of physical changes. So if this feels uncomfortable, please take a break. It'll only be about 2 to 3 minutes at most, I think, to sort of break down some of what would be considered normal medically. I think it is important, though, because this is information that sometimes isn't readily shared, particularly in the birth world. And it can feel very scary, and it can feel very isolating when you're going through these experiences and having these responses. So moving forward with this information, everybody's body is individual and everybody's journey is unique. So that's why I keep saying what is normal in quotes, because I really want to highlight that this isn't being shared to make you feel like maybe this doesn't match your experience, but what can be considered within a range of normalcy. And of course, if you have any questions relating to yourself, if you are living through this experience and or have concerns around physical changes, I would recommend connecting with your healthcare professional. So just to dive right into some of the bigger changes that occur. So weight gain can really range from anywhere from 10 to 45 pounds, sometimes even into the 50-pound range, and be considered normal. And I think that speaks to that individualized journey very much so. Breasts essentially have been preparing to nurse since you got pregnant. So there will be an increase in size. Areolas will become darker and nipples may be larger. In terms of pre-pregnancy uterus, your uterus sits at about the size of a pear pre-pregnancy. By the end of pregnancy, your uterus is about the size of a watermelon. So your body's gone through some pretty significant changes. Immediately after birth, you're looking at it shrinking to about the size of a grapefruit, and it'll sit right sort of at your belly button, and it should feel hard to touch. With breastfeeding, that can trigger some really lovely hormones, which then induce some fun cramping, and that leads to the uterus shrinking over time. I'll touch base on the hormones in just a second, but I thought that was an important point, that the hormones really play into the physical changes and the recovery piece quite a lot. So with the weight that can be lost after you're looking at about 9 to 12 pounds immediately postpartum. And that includes baby, placenta, amniotic fluid, all of that fun stuff that essentially is coming out of your body immediately after birth. I would say by day 2 or 3, you're looking at what would physically perceive to be about 4 to 6 months pregnant. And over a period of about 8 months, again, that range can be different for every person, but your body will recover and will tighten. And of course, one piece that is important here is that your body may never go back. And that is a piece that a lot of the conversation, a lot of the work that I'm doing clinically comes into play, is helping individuals come to terms with that piece. Stretch marks will fade to a lighter tone, typically by 8 months postpartum also, but may not disappear completely. And bleeding is something that a lot of questions can come into play. I hear questions around bleeding quite a lot. It can occur in the postpartum period anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks. If you're hitting past that point, then I would recommend connecting with your family doctor also. I think the bottom point there is something that I really want to highlight, that it took you 9 months to have these changes to your body to occur. So patience and acceptance are key for body positivity moving forward, and body acceptance moving forward, because this isn't something that happened overnight. So having the expectation and having that sense of urgency to get back to pre-pregnancy body can set you up for failure sometimes, and reminding yourself that this is a journey. Okay, hormones. Hormones is an area that I really enjoy talking about, and it's something that I hope to gain more knowledge on as I move forward, because they are so pivotal both in the eating disorder world and in the pregnancy world. So I wanted to start with some of the 3 big hormones that can come into play moving forward with pregnancy, and break them down a little bit and why they are very important. So progesterone, it transforms the uterine lining by thickening it, so that way the embryo can be received and essentially allow the pregnancy to be maintained. Estrogen is one that is consistently part of an individual's life if they live with a uterus, and the numbers will, or the amount will, increase during the pregnancy period. It helps with blood vessels in the placenta and the uterus, so again, it helps with maintaining the pregnancy and helping the pregnancy thrive. And then oxytocin, lovely oxytocin, it is sometimes considered the love hormone. It's very much associated with empathy, trust, sexual activity, relationship building. It increases during periods of hugging, sex, orgasms, snuggling, loving moments, tickling, all of that fun stuff. So oxytocin is something that I try to use a lot in birth work to help speed up labor also. So encouraging women to tickle underneath their arm, or having sex with their partner if they're starting to look at inducing pregnancy. It's a really wonderful hormone that it does a lot of great things for the body. So, and then through breastfeeding, the process of breastfeeding can increase oxytocin, which then it provokes the cramping that I was talking about on the past slide, that can allow the uterus to shrink. So it's a really wonderful piece of our body that does a lot of great things. Following the birth, following the pregnancy, the body is filled with a very large rush of hormones. So the postpartum hormone drop is considered the single largest drop or increase in hormones throughout any life stage for a human. So during pregnancy, our estrogen and progesterone levels will increase to something like taking 100 birth control pills a day. But by day 3 postpartum, you're essentially back to the baseline pre-pregnancy. So you can imagine it's sort of like a PMS on steroids. It's a huge crash that can feel very uncomfortable. And I'll talk a little bit more about baby blues later on, but just a hint at that, it is a very large factor, and that crash can play into that. So it's very common to feel very energized and excited immediately after the birth and for the following days after, and then follow with a very low, very tired sense due to that drop in hormones. You can feel weepy and emotional, especially around day 3 when that drop is happening, and it typically coincides also with when your milk is coming in. So there's a variety of fun things that can come into play there. Another piece that I think is important to note in terms of eating disorders and hormones, with pregnancy, there's a significant change in hormones that are important to appetite, such as leptin. So leptin levels are high for those who live with binge eating disorders and can be significantly lower with those living with anorexia and bulimia. So leptin concentrates, it rises during pregnancy. And then there's a drop following, and then it increases again following the next 6 months into the postpartum period. So this means hunger cues can feel very different than they did pre-pregnancy. Appetite regulation can feel very different than it did before, and this can be distressing for some. So I'm sharing this to remind that this is natural, and this is a normal part of that process, that those hormones are shifting. I wanted to save some space to talk about perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, or PMADS. Why are we discussing PMADS? Research shows us that women with a history of eating disorders, or individuals within a history of eating disorders, have more symptoms of anxiety and depression compared to those without in the postpartum period. It can exacerbate the challenges of eating disorder recovery, and it can contribute to the developmental of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. So if we're able to help educate, or if I'm able to help you be educated on perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, the hope is that we can catch the flags early. So there is a variety of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. It is the most common complication of pregnancy and childbirth, and I think that's something that is not commonly discussed or acknowledged, and I think it's something that is important to touch on. So 1 in 5 birth persons and 1 in 5 birth partners will experience a perinatal mood and anxiety disorder in some way, shape, or form. So with that experience, that can be very triggering or exacerbate symptoms, as I had previously discussed. With PMADS, the most common would be postpartum depression. So I have a little nice infographic there that shows some of the symptoms that can be present with perinatal or with postpartum depression. It does present very similar to how it would during a typical depression diagnosis. The difference is that it can be very focused on the parenting system. It can be very focused on their ability to parent, that mom guilt, the shame, all of that fun stuff that comes into play. So this can occur regardless of whether you are a first-time parent or have had previous pregnancies too. So every pregnancy is different. Risk factors can change. Some of the risk factors for PMADS, which we will discuss a little bit more in detail, can be grief and loss, hormonal imbalances, body changes, financial changes, sleep, relationship changes. So if we're reflecting on that, essentially everything related to the transformation that comes with pregnancy and with postpartum. So no wonder it's the most common complication of pregnancy and childbirth. With postpartum anxiety, similar to postpartum depression, the symptoms do look very similar. There can be postpartum or perinatal anxiety also, which it can focus a lot on the worries of the future with baby and what that looks like, what could be wrong with my baby, what is wrong with my baby, what if this happens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In some cases, women can feel very overwhelmed with thoughts of harming themselves or baby. This would be diagnosed as OCD within the perinatal mood and anxiety disorder section. The thing that differentiates that from postpartum psychosis, which is quite rare, it's 1 in 1,000 individuals will experience that, is that an individual with psychosis, there is an intent to harm the child or themselves, where with OCD, these intrusive thoughts can be very scary and they don't have any interest in following through. So that's a really important point to keep in mind if you are in a healthcare role looking at those symptoms. Okay. So in terms of baby blues versus PMADS, I thought this is a nice little infographic that really helps sum it up. So baby blues are very much connected to the crash in hormone changes after birth. It is so common that the stats are 4 out of 5 birth persons will experience this. It can last a few days or it can last a few weeks, but the key point is that it will pass with no need for treatment. So finding the space to connect with supports and find that space to feel what you need to feel and allow those hormones to regulate is a very important piece. So that's sort of the nitty-gritty of what the postpartum period looks like and what eating disorder symptoms look like through that experience. I wanted to start with outlining why these things are especially difficult during the postpartum period. And I think the window of tolerance does a great job of that. So the window of tolerance is a theory that I use a lot in my practice. It helps me better describe and understand experiences for people. So most people it's more difficult to regulate emotions during the postpartum period for a lot of reasons, and I think this describes it very well. So everyone has what would be considered an optimal zone of functioning. So in this infographic, that would be where the rainbow is. And during that period, it's when individuals are most able to function effectively. When people are in this zone, they're able to process and integrate information much more effectively. They're able to respond to the demands of everyday life without much difficulty. And then comes in some of the fight, flight, or freeze symptoms. So for those of you that may not be familiar with this is a psychological reaction that occurs in response to feeling that there's a harmful event occurring. So the example that gets used a lot is that this was something that became part of us in caveman days to help us when there was a threat of a bear or a wolf or whatever it be. And it's not the most helpful nowadays, and that's why the window of tolerance can be helpful to help reduce those fight, flight, or freeze responses. So on the right side of the rainbow, you're going to see a little bit of a cloud with the thunder and the rain. That side would be considered hyperarousal. So that's where that fight or flight response comes in. It's typically characterized with hypervigilance, feelings of anxiety, panic, racing thoughts. So more of that extreme escalation. Where on the left side of the rainbow, you have the hypoarousal. So it's more of that freeze response. It can feel like shutting down. There's emotional numbness that can come with it, emptiness, even like feeling very paralyzed and stuck. So what happens over time is when we're not able to effectively take care of ourselves, like we aren't sometimes in the postpartum period, which I'm going to discuss in the next slide, though clouds can come in and cover up quite a bit of that window of optimal functioning, which is the rainbow. And that means it's a lot more easy to engage in eating disorder behaviors or just distressing responses that maybe don't feel like the most optimal approach to things. So this is a really handy tool that I actually learned during my time at Sheena's place, and I bring it with me everywhere I go because I think it's very relevant, especially in regards to disordered eating symptoms. So some of the things that come into play that reduce our window of tolerance and make those clouds a little bit bigger is these four things here that the acronym is HALT that we use. So typically there's connections between the experiences of engaging in eating disorders and these responses. So I think taking some space to check in on if before you're engaging in what could be a self-destructive behavior, reminding yourself, am I hungry? Am I lonely? Am I tired? Am I angry? I messed up the acronym there, but you get the point, it's all there. So I would love to take a little bit of space to just touch on all four of these a little bit more. There's some really great questions on that slide there that are helpful to remind yourself of in that experience or to remind a client of in that experience. But these are all things that, again, during the postpartum period can be very difficult to address. So no wonder symptoms of eating disorders flare back up during this time or exasperate. So with hunger, it's not only about the physical feeling of hunger, but the emotional struggle that comes along with the eating during the postpartum period. So for many in the perinatal period, there can be a lot of nutritional advice, restrictions on foods recommended by your healthcare team. This is a universal struggle that comes with pregnant people, and it can lead to intense hunger cravings. If you're not feeling like you're getting enough hunger or getting enough food, it can lead to some pretty intense hunger cravings, and those hormones that I was speaking about earlier also come into play here. So it's very common to feel extra hungry during the postpartum period, especially if you are breastfeeding. And then there's also another piece around gestational diabetes that I wanted to save some space to discuss. Gestational diabetes is a very common diagnosis that comes during the pregnancy period. And it can be you have to be essentially very mindful about the way you're eating. You have to eat in a specific way in order to ensure baby's health. And that can feel very triggering and cause a lot of barriers for individuals that are also living with disordered eating struggles. So I'll talk a little bit more about feeding and eating with baby in a little bit. I wanted to save a slide for that because I think it is something important that comes into play. So I'll touch a little bit more on that later. But anger, of course. With the window of tolerance shrinking, it's much more easy to feel angry and in turn engage in eating disorder symptoms. So I think finding the space to check in on yourself about what is making me angry, why am I feeling angry, and finding the space to address that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into ways to tackle and ways to support, but just saving some space to say mom rage is common and it is normal and it does come. So, and then loneliness. I think especially with the climate of the world right now, parenting can feel very lonely very quickly. It's isolating to begin with, and there's often a very common fear of reaching out to others for support for a variety of reasons. So checking in with yourself and checking in on that loneliness piece and finding ways to fill that gap can be really helpful to increase your window of optimal functioning. I have a whole fun slide for tiredness also because I think it's very relevant and very important. Elf is one of my favorite movies, and this is a quote that just sticks with me, and I think it really highlights the feelings of parenthood. So I slept great last night. I got a full 40 minutes. Lack of sleep is a given to be present at the start and the postpartum period, unfortunately. And lack of sleep can be the key ingredient involved in the perinatal mental health concerns. So it's essential to good mental health, yet no parent is getting it. It's a really tricky place to be sitting with. There's the questions of, do I co-sleep? Do I not co-sleep? Sleep training, it's very draining. And the key point that I can really give here is it gets easier and you're not alone through that process. And as time goes on, baby will get into a better sleep routine, and finding the space to sleep whenever you can is very important. So as promised, here's my fun slide around feeding. If eating disorder is swaying your decision making, then feeding baby can feel very distressing and lead to struggles. Breastfeeding comes with a variety of challenges as well as conflicting messages on what is and isn't appropriate to eat. And parents can very commonly feel unsure about types of food for their child, mealtime conflicts. There's a variety of reasons for that. I think a lot of it is societal. There's cultural pieces involved, and also it's just information that isn't readily available, and everyone has a different opinion on what's right and what isn't right, including myself, and that's why I'm here today. So if you are breastfeeding, I would love to share a little piece that I think is important. If you aren't familiar with Jack Newman, I would highly recommend looking into some of his information. He's a wonderful resource. I think he's actually out of Toronto, but he is a big advocate for feeding babies and breastfeeding supports, and he has a clinic, I believe. And the breastfeeding information, something that he shares quite often that really resonated with me, is that breastfeeding information can be presented sometimes from a position of privilege. Don't eat processed foods, don't eat sugars, avoid substances, don't drink coffee, God forbid you drink coffee. And it can feel very scary for individuals who can't afford those recommended foods, or maybe are working night shifts while also being parents and need that caffeine or whatever it be. And it can feel scary to the point of often choosing to not breastfeed as a result. And the point that I want to highlight here is that breast milk does not change very much based on what your dietary intake is. And you can do your own research, but this is what Jack Newman has shared and what my research has brought me to also, that it changes from morning to evening, day to day, but not very much because of the food intake. So keeping that in mind can be helpful. Thank you, Caitlin. I appreciated you sharing that. So Caitlin just chucked the Jack Newman's resource into the chat there for everyone too. So struggles to feed your child can also have a very difficult, it feels difficult for individuals to bond effectively with their baby, especially with newborns. One of the key ways to bond feels like it's through eating. So I have a resource at the end here called 0 to 3. It's a wonderful website with 1,000 different resources on a variety of different things, but they have a really great list of ways to bond with baby and increased bonds with baby. And the majority of them are not feeding and eating related. So that's one that I often will share with families. So my last slide here, kind of on the understanding the struggles that come with this process, is one that I think is very important. There's a huge shift in identity and often in body shape, and many are handling this alone. So there's a loss of a formal self, as I've been sort of hinting at throughout this process, and it is a grieving period. So for many women, or for birth persons and parents in general, there's grieving accompanied with this loss of coping skills or coping mechanisms, for example, even changes in body shape, changes in finances. It can feel very scary, and again, feel very lonely, and it's unsure to even know who you are as a person after time. Days and days go by where you're alone just with baby sometimes, and it can feel distressing and uncomfortable. So most birthing persons are also navigating this shift alone without leadership or without their community. And there tends to be a deep-rooted belief that we're supposed to figure it out alone because our parents did. And I'm really trying to break that, because I feel that there's a place here for us to feel connected and feel that we don't need to be alone. And at Maternal Health Niagara, our vision is essentially to build your circle of support. And I think that is an important piece. So these are two things that I think come up a lot in terms of loss of former self and with the cultural piece. So there's a very common concern for parents that are living with eating disorder symptoms or body image struggles, that will I bounce back to my pre-pregnancy shape and pre-baby weight and shape, which I started to discuss a little bit, but I think there's a lot of dominant beliefs that that's something that we're told. We see it all the time. Look at Princess. Oh my goodness, when she was 2 days postpartum, all of a sudden she's showing up in a beautiful dress and her hair's all done up, and we see these things on television shows. I can think of a variety of sitcoms where an individual have a baby and then two episodes later they're just back at whatever they're at, and I'm like, where's the baby? What is going on? It's just, so I think highlighting that these changes do occur is very important. And the images that we see of birth persons are very limited, and this can create a lot of a comparison between parents and a very high expectation of perfectionism. So with dominant cultural ideals, it's often, there's definitions of what is considered a good parent and how birth persons should shape their identities and what behaviors are deemed appropriate for parents. So birth persons are often characterized as being very nurturing, passive, domestic, self-sacrificing. But then there's this other side of things where there's a very competitive version of parenthood, where especially mothers can have feel like there's an expectation to not only be selfless caregivers, but also maintain successful careers and live outside of the domestic sphere at the same time. And it's a very difficult space to be in, and there's a lot of work that I do in that space, because helping to redefine identity is huge. So I think the important point here is that parenthood should not be perceived as a universal experience, because all birth persons are experiencing things differently. So, okay, so what do we do about it? I'm going to dive right in. So I think this is the point where I'm going to get a little bit more into context of strategies. I know. So if there's any questions along, just let me know. Preparation is huge, and congrats to all of you that are here that are pregnant or are in the postpartum period, because you're already doing a lot of the legwork. It's important to learn and expect what to expect regarding upcoming physical and emotional challenges, how the postpartum affects your eating disorder, what the risks are. So just like today, thank you very much for being here. This can be helpful to plan for the best and the worst. So finding the space to educate yourself, plan and anticipate triggers. I will discuss this a little bit more, and monitoring your risks and monitoring your symptoms. So making sure you're getting the best care throughout and noticing the changes and connecting with your sports so you get back on track, if possible, can be really helpful. There can be days that go by and you realize, oh, I didn't even have a shower, haven't had a shower in a week, because you're just in the thralls of parenthood. And finding the space to be mindful and monitor that, and in the pregnancy period and starting that process, then monitoring how you're eating, if that feels safe for you within your eating disorder safety plan or treatment plan, if there's capacity for that, can be helpful also. So coming to acknowledge that this is a transformation and this is a transition is huge. Finding that acceptance can bring a lot of peace and can be very helpful. Changes will occur in the body and it's a natural part of the process. So yeah. So preparation, I'm just continuing to build on this piece. Again, circle of support is something that I think is very core to myself and to Maternal Health Niagara's team. So finding the space to advocate, ensure all healthcare professionals and supports are learning about what are your triggers, what is helpful, what is not helpful. If they're not familiar with eating disorders in the birth world, finding that space can be really, really nice. Finding space to consult with pediatricians, doulas, parent coaches, lactation consultants, nurses that may have specializations in that can also be helpful to make sure you're on the right track. And share what feels right with your supports. I think sometimes there's a pressure to share too much, or in society, as I previously discussed, to manage it alone. So do what feels right to you that you think is going to be most beneficial through your journey. Online supports right now in particular are huge. So supports such as Sheena's Place are great. Finding forums and chat rooms, Facebook groups. Of course, I want to just put out there that in the eating disorder world, I know that that can be a very tricky space to be navigating, and it can be a triggering space. So knowing yourself and knowing what feels right. The PMADS app, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, I would highly recommend sharing it with yourself and with others. If you're pregnant, trying to get pregnant in the postpartum period, it's a really cool app. It's sort of like a dating app for you to connect with birthing persons or with parents that are around the same timeline as you or have similar interests as you. So really strong connections can be made. I think the important piece here is that talking with someone about your stress actually increases your oxytocin and decreases the symptoms of anxiety, depression pretty quickly. So talking about this can be very helpful, and realizing that you're not alone in this, even though it's not comfortable, it is somewhat normal. So finding that space can be great. Another point I had written down that I forgot, I apologize. So if you are consulting or talking with your supports, when you're asking or when you're choosing to share, thinking about what am I trying to gain by sharing this information? Put intention behind the words. It can make it feel a lot more easy to get help for yourself. And I know asking for help is something that is very difficult. This is something that comes up in my practice quite a lot. It can feel like a very selfish act to be asking for help. So one of the recommendations that I typically make is use I statements and find a way to give a different perspective on how, if you're asking for help, it helps not only yourself, but your entire family system as a whole. So if, for example, you need to put the garbage out and you're just so mentally drained, you're at the end of it, and you're not comfortable asking your partner to do it, maybe he had a really difficult day or they had a difficult day also, finding the space to remind yourself that if my partner is able to help me with this, then I'm going to be able to have some space to regenerate and be a better partner, be a better caregiver. So putting that perspective behind it of how it's not only helping yourself, but helping your family or helping your system can be very great and change the perspective for individuals that are struggling to ask for help. You don't have to like being a parent all the time. This is something that I say far too often, and I think is really important and very powerful to share. Parenting, like anything, is truly paradoxical. It can have the highest highs and it can have the lowest lows. And knowing that you don't have to like it all the time can make way for some really deep sharing and to feel very safe. It can reduce a lot of guilt, and it'll reduce a lot of shame in the process too. With parenthood, there is a lot of frustration, impatience, anger, and guilt, but also a lot of compassion, tenderness, and devotion. So it's a journey, and finding the space to say, today is not a day that I'm enjoying parenting. My kid is driving me nuts. Please do, and don't have the guilt behind it if you can, because it's normal and it's natural. I think this is just a wonderful quote that I really enjoyed. There's no way to be a perfect mother, but a million ways to be a good one. If you need a break, it's okay to take a break. If you need the TV to help you babysit for a little while, to take a breath and breathe for a moment, I think that's okay. If it feels right for you, I think remind yourself that infants and children are very, very resilient individuals. And that is an important piece, that there's typically a fear that every little piece of what you're doing, you're making a mistake, can be difficult to cope with, and that you're going to mess your child up. And reminding yourself that children are very resilient, and infants are very resilient can be helpful. And if you're worried, I hear this a lot, a fear of that they're not good enough, or they're not doing good enough. If you're yourself are worried about not being enough of a parent, that tells me that you're doing more than enough. That you have that worry behind you, and that fear typically means that there's a motivation there to also help fix that process, and that you care enough about your children that you want them to be in a good space and be in a good place. So congrats. I would love to take a little bit of space to complete a small activity. This comes into what I was previously talking about, that loss of identity. And this is something that I really enjoy doing. This is something that at Maternal Health Niagara, my supervisor shared with me this specific analogy, and I really like it. So I've moved forward with stealing it from her. So thank you in advance, Emily. Your awareness of self can be foggy after a life transition into parenthood, into multiple, if you're a parent of multiple children, even it's different from having an only child or having 3 child children. It's a constant transition and transformation, and it can be overwhelming. So to find the space to be aware of yourself and have a self concept helps you grow and embrace the transition that can come with the postpartum period, and help you find a new definition of yourself. So I would love to take some space in the chat, or if someone's open enough to share, to think about your self-concept in a way of different hats. So for example, what hats are you wearing on a regular day? I wear a working hat, I wear a creative hat, I wear a parenting hat, and what hats are kind of been stashed away on the coat rack and maybe are covered up by other hats and scarves and things like that, that maybe you're hoping to bring back in. So starting that conversation around what pieces of your identity maybe you don't feel as connected to, that you want to be more connected to, and finding ways to integrate that into parenting is what I'm kind of looking for here. Does anyone have anything they want to share? I can share a little bit of my experience. So one piece of myself that I wanted to reclaim through parenthood was my creativity. I really like to express myself through creativity, and I found it was very draining to find the space to journal or draw or paint. So I started singing more, and finding the space to sing specifically with my son was very helpful for me, and or singing in the shower also. So finding ways to integrate that piece of myself in a new way it helped me to know myself a little bit better and find ways to really embrace who I am. I'm just going to pause for a moment and see if anyone has anything. think I'm going to move on then if everyone's good there. So I'm going to talk about self-care. I'm hoping to do it in a bit of a way that can be a little bit more beneficial than take a bubble bath. So learning to engage in self-care is not selfish. On the contrary, I find it key to self-preservation. So finding the space to evaluate and see what you need will be very helpful. I'm going to share a resource list also at the end of this presentation that you will all be getting in a PDF form that outlines some of my favorite self-care strategies that I've put together for parents that are feeling overly stressed. So most of them are small activities that can be taken and integrated in a really wonderful way. The next few slides I'm going to show you are going to be ways to incorporate self-care in a way that is deeper. It can feel like a lot of preparation and also building a plan. So finding the space to prepare and do that work down the line can be very beneficial and be some self-preservation. So I want to start with zones of regulation. This is a core concept that Maternal Health Niagara really enjoys also. I think it's really wonderful. I learned about zones of regulation during my time, but I still am also part of through working with children in a school board setting. So zones was designed to help gain skills in order to consistently or consciously, regulate people's actions, which then leads to an increased level of problem solving and control. So breaking down emotions in terms of colors, it can feel really easy, very simple and very concise, and you can build a plan around it. So I'm just gonna kind of break down the colors a little bit and then talk about how that plan can look. So with the blue zone, you're in more of that state of lower state. So it could look like sickness, depression, feeling bored, tired. Whereas in the green zone, it's more of those positive, alert emotions, happiness, pride, calmness, contentness, ready to learn. The yellow zone, you're sitting with more of that hyper arousal sense of feeling excited, silly, worried, embarrassed. And then with the red zone, it's a space of where it's very common to feel upset, angry, mad, terrified, and even out of control. So using the language I find in my private practice of what color are you feeling, or allowing a partner or my client to share with their partner what color they're feeling can be a very simple way to help put a plan in place very quickly based on that experience. So depending on what zone you're in, for example, if you're sitting in the blue zone, they have like the little markers at the top: rest area, go, slow, stop. I think that's a really general idea of how it could work. So if you're in blue, find some space to ground yourself and relax. But it can be a lot more concrete. So to say, you know what, I'm in the blue zone. When I'm in the blue zone, I find it most commonly helpful to take a nice shower, get a hug from my partner, maybe read a book, take some deep breaths. So writing that out and having that plan readily available can be really nice. When I'm in the green zone, that's a space where I feel appropriate to maybe have some more difficult conversations. So maybe I'll call my mom and talk about that thing that's been making me feel overwhelmed because I'm sitting in the green zone right now. And pro tip, acknowledging the colors out loud, non-judgmentally, can help take away some of the power that those feelings have over you also. So finding the space to acknowledge openly, I'm in the yellow zone right now, and taking some deep breaths and putting that plan in place from there. This is another core concept that we use at Maternal Health Niagara that I think is really basic and really wonderful and can be helpful. So everyone has a gas tank essentially, and throughout the day that gas tank can become very drained very quickly, and finding ways to refuel that gas tank is very important. And ways to increase that or refuel would be the self-care strategies. So whether it be a rewarding action like accomplishing a task around the house, or an enjoyable task like I had talked about, taking a shower, reading a book, snuggling, whatever it be, can be very helpful. So finding the space to acknowledge throughout the day where your gas tank is at is a great starting point. So as a result, you can start to monitor and notice the patterns. So for myself, when I started this activity in my everyday life, I noticed that my gas tank was very quickly drained at the start of my day. And when I started to reflect on the activities I was doing, my alarm would go off, I would roll over to my side of the bed, pick up my phone, and I would immediately start reading work emails, checking Facebook notifications, and I was very quickly drained because I already had all of these thoughts going on of what my day is going to look like and what I need to achieve, and oh my goodness, I need to email this person back and that person. And then I wake up, brush my teeth, my son gets out of bed, and he's in a mood because it's first thing in the morning and I'm trying to get him ready for preschool and brushing his teeth and all that fun stuff. And next thing you know, my window of tolerance is completely gone and I'm snapping. So by evaluating that and recognizing that picking up my phone is actually quite a draining activity, making a choice to put that aside and instead, when I wake up, put in an energizing activity, like taking a moment to take a couple deep breaths, do a meditation, for me is something that works really well. This is my favorite mantra that I wanted to share. I have it up in my mirror in my room. I think mantras and affirmations are something that I really enjoy using, and my clients tend to really enjoy using also. Mantras and affirmations have been known to help do some really deep subconscious conditioning around self-image and self-esteem. It's a very powerful and very gentle practice. It can be helpful to counter some of that negative self-talk or some of those unhelpful thinking styles that can come into place. So finding the space to repeat this to yourself, depending on what headspace you're in. For some people, it's helpful when you're in the yellow zone to have a specific mantra when you're in the yellow zone, and have a different mantra for when you're in the blue zone, and when you're in the green zone, have a different mantra. And finding the space to do those throughout the day, or having little post-it notes of them up around your house as good reminders. If you don't mind the tacky post-it notes everywhere, it's something I would highly recommend. So. This is a pretty quick list of resources that that were some of the key ones to me that I thought were important. Caitlin shared some of the links also in the chat, but this is something you will get after the fact also. So there's some great things there that are primarily pregnancy related, but there are some that are eating disorder connected also. So my final takeaway at this point, I'm running a little bit ahead of time. I apologize. I expected a little bit more connection in terms of conversation, but I'm happy to share what I have so far. So these are some of my big takeaways, really, is coming to a place of celebrating what your body is doing and not just what it looks like. And your body may never be the same, but neither will you through this process, because as I said, this is a really overwhelming transformation. So finding the space to acknowledge that you're not the same and you may never be the same is something that I think is very key. So. Okay, I would love to spend a little bit of time to share any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Taylor. That was amazing. If folks have questions, feel free to type them into the chat or ask them out loud. We have quite a bit of time, so we can get around to as many questions as you have. I see something in the chat now from Jamie. Taylor, can you reiterate the leptin part, please?
Sure, I can go back to this slide even if that would be helpful for you guys. So for myself, I don't have a great amount of knowledge and education on specific to eating disorders and the that are involved in that process, but I do know that with leptin in particular, it's something that we all have, and it helps to regulate our bodies, and it helps to regulate our feeding and eating processes. So it helps remind us of when we're hungry, when we've ate too much, when we're satisfied, and it also is part of just the regulation of eating. So during the post period, just pulling up my slide here, during the postpartum period, there is a shift in that specific hormone. So from the start of pregnancy, leptin concentrations will increase. And then following the delivery, there will be that drop, and then it will slowly begin to increase again up until the 6-month period. I wish I could share with you the reason why that is. I will be honest that I don't know. But what I do know is that the hunger cues can feel very different than they did pre-pregnancy. If, for example, you were an individual that was living with anorexia, then the leptin concentrations are lower. If you're living with binge eating or something else where the leptin levels would be higher, then you're more likely to have more hunger cues come into play. So either way, you're going to feel more hungry throughout the pregnancy period. So appetite regulation can be very different as a result. And as a result, feels very distressing for individuals in that period. Thank you, Caitlin. That's a great idea. I haven't seen this article either, so I'll give it a read. Any other questions? Okay, I think I'm gonna call that it then, if everyone's good with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's that time of day. People are probably
Totally.
preparing for dinner, maybe experiencing some hunger and
Totally.
wanting to get to that. I will, just before everyone goes, share a link to an evaluation that we have. It'll also be sent in an email to everyone right at 7 o'clock. We would be really appreciative if you could fill out this evaluation. This will help us with future webinars in terms of, providing some of the same great content or improving on what we're providing. So they are anonymous. You can skip whatever questions you don't want to answer, and we would be really appreciative if you could fill that out. Taylor and I can hang around for a few extra minutes if anyone does have a question that you'd like to ask. Otherwise, it was really, really wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Taylor. I know I learned a ton. This is not something that I know all that much about, even working within the eating disorders field. So thank you so much, everyone. And please feel free to send me an email if you have any follow-up questions, and I can pass them along to Taylor.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today and being a part of this process. I've really enjoyed it.